We are here with another Fireside Chat. I'm Sandro Mancuso. I'm here with José and Mashooq from Codurance. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of you that are following this series and leaving your comments. We received quite a few comments both on YouTube and on Twitter of people requesting topics. And as always, we went through the topics. We picked this one. Quite a few people were asking us to talk about current state of Agile, how developers feel about Agile, and even like, is it possible to bring developers back together with Agile? So we found this a very interesting topic, very close to our hearts. So what is Agile anyway? So if we go back in time, so maybe it's worth starting from what was the original idea? So let's just phrase or frame the problem in what was Agile and where we are.
Okay, well, I can start. I mean, we can talk about waterfall, and we can talk about very heavy development processes and all those kind of things, and we can talk about history. But I'd like to talk about the manifesto, right? And from there, try to understand behind those, 8 phrases, basically, right? So Agile talks about individuals and interactions, because there were lots of the development processes were all becoming about the process and tools, right? So it's about humanity. It's about people coming together and talking together and interacting to achieve something, and putting that before any process. It was about working software, right? It was about customer collaboration, and it was about responding to change, right? So rather than kind of plans that you follow regardless of any feedback, those kind of things, right? So the way I see it was Agile was about taking all the fluff out and all these overcomplications that we made for ourselves, and saying, well, actually, it's about writing. It's the software that we are writing as a result. And it's about teams, how people interact with each other in order to decide how to write the software and cooperate on writing that software. And it's about feedback, so that when you are delivering early and you're getting that feedback and being close to the customer. So it was very much anti kind of processes or comprehensive processes. It was all about people, small teams coming together, talking to each other, talking to the customer, and building the software and responding to the feedback when you are delivering early. To me, that's what the essence of Agile was.
I completely agree. I think one of the issues with that is that you can quickly replace software by delivering value. And then, it goes beyond the spectrum of, and because all of those concepts, adaptation, teamwork, and so on, they can be applied to whatever context if you remove the software aspect. And this is, I think, something that happened quite quickly with the adoption, because as it was starting to be used within the software or building software context, you quickly find the boundaries that are not software within the organization, but a lot of the concepts are applicable, right? Mm-hmm. So you try to make it broader in its core concepts, and try to apply it to other situations that may not be the ones that it was originally designed for, right? And then value, in when you're talking about software, working software as a measure of progress, that's the deliverable, that's the way that we know if we're delivering the value. When you go into marketing, or when you go into a different function within the organization, that concept starts being a bit more nebulous in some cases, right? And also I feel that there's an aspect there of, because it's in its core, let's say, a philosophy or a mindset, people can approach it from very different ways, right? Like you don't have to have a software development background in order to understand what these principles are, right? And to see them, right? So I think that already started, moving things in a different direction than what it was maybe originally intended in that sense. You're muted.
From what I remember from history was when those 17 people went to the ski resort, they were representing very different methodologies, right? So they went like from extreme programming to Crystal to feature-driven development to Scrum, and there were the pragmatic programmer guys. So there were slightly different, like probably 6 different groups in a way, and a few more independent, representing those different methodologies. But one thing that they were able to join, for example, you had like two of them were in the extremes. Like Scrum was more on the process side, and XP more on the more technical side. Although there is some history that Scrum had some technical practices as well that were dropped at some point, and they were not far from the extreme programming practices. But my understanding back then was what they had in common, and the way that they were able to combine all of those different ideas into a single mindset was that at the center was a very simple principle that was fast feedback loop, inspect and adapt. And everything derives from that. From the process side, with iterations and demos and retrospectives and things like that, to test-driven development, to pair programming, to continuous integration. The principle is exactly the same. It's a very short feedback loop, try to minimize the feedback loop, and the agility comes from, as you reduce the feedback loop, you gain more information, and the agility is the inspection and adaptation, in fact, the adaptation, right? So that's, for me, at heart, is what Agile means to me, is that ability to adapt given new information.
You can actually apply that to interactions as well, as individuals and interactions, because it's the kind of that phrase goes individuals and interactions over processes and tools, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's also about fast feedback, because when you are speaking to someone, when you're communicating directly rather than using documentation or other means or tools and these kind of things, there is a lot said, using a very high bandwidth way of communicating, but also there is an immediate response, there is an immediate feedback, and there's a discussion, and that is the epitome of quick feedback, right? And that's also, you can apply, not only the technical practices and so on, but you can apply the interaction aspects, and not only small batches in terms of delivering software, but the like talking to people as part of that quick feedback principle.
So why do you think then there's this outcry, let's say, for Agile is losing its essence, we need to bring developers back into this thing? What do you think that's about?
I don't think that it's losing. I think it lost a long time ago, right? So I remember, like, I was really excited about Agile the first time I heard about it, right? So because, like, probably like some of you, I was coming from the old ways. Like, I started in mid-90s, and back in Brazil, we had software factories, right? That's how we call them, software factories. And we had waterfall process, and the most modern companies we had there, we were using rational unified process. Some of you might remember the RUP and stuff, and all the different diagrams and stuff. So we had, although it was an iterative methodology, the iterations or the phases within each iteration were quite big, because we had to produce all the diagrams and all the inception and delivery and testing and so on. So when I heard first about Agile, I was actually excited about it. I said, wow, we're going to work as close to the business. Developers will have a voice. We're going to work as a single team, and everyone is focused on, let's remove all the unnecessary things that we do. So just focus on delivering value, as you were saying. Just focus on getting shit done, basically. So I was really excited about it. But for some reason, like, well, I have my own views on that. But in my view, Agile took a detour because some of the Agile methodologies became far more popular than others. So Scrum, for example, had a far bigger appeal to management, because management, they manage, right? So and that promise of, well, or the promise or the misinterpretation that you could deliver things faster, because it was not exactly that you would do things faster. You would have faster feedback. It's slightly different. So Scrum was widely adopted. For me, it was a blessing and a curse at the same time. But because Scrum and the focus on the process was widely adopted, then Agile started evolving. The community and Agile in general evolved more on the process side. And then people that were more focused on the development side, like it was my case, we felt that the engineering disciplines or extreme programming was not coming along. And that made myself and a few people that I know extremely disappointed.
I have a bit of a different view on that, because I feel like a lot of the friction comes from, for me, the Agile Manifesto sort of defines a foundation, or let's call it a culture, right? Or codifies a culture in which these methodologies can thrive. Yeah. So if you already, find that it's important to, collaborate with the customer or adapt to change, or like these things will help you with that. What it won't do is, change something that is completely opposite, yeah, through applying the method. And I feel that's where a lot of the friction comes from, right? Like the application of agile methodologies in a context that is not agile, yeah, and then calling that we're doing agile, right? that's
I had just written exactly that. What if Agile was actually not designed for the vast majority of the software development organizations, right? Because in most cases, software development happens at quite a large scale. It happens in many bureaucratic organizations, right? And Agile is actually small scale. It's about keeping teams small. It's about that whole team. It's about being close to the customer. It's about being able to talk to anyone that you need to talk to. And it's about quite a well-defined, but not a massive scope, right? So it becomes unwieldy when you are talking about these large organizations and large IT departments that have thousands of developers sometimes and hundreds of development teams. So the Agile was not really answering that question. How do you take those cultures, those ways of organizing, and move them towards this highly agile or high agility kind of small organizations? And so what happened was that, some of the practices were taken in because they were considered, very reasonable and they seemed to make sense, but they had somehow to fit into that other culture that wasn't going to change in the most fundamental way it needed to change for this to actually work, which is to take down those hierarchies, take down those silos, but also reduce the cognitive load to kind of create these mini organizations that had their own value to deliver. That was never going to happen in those organizations. And so it was doomed from the beginning in that kind of context.
Yeah, but here goes a few background information as well, because some of this stuff happened by design, right? So it's no coincidence that those 17 people never met again. It's no coincidence that they don't shake hands and appear together in all sorts of events around the world, right? So what happened right after the summit, like a year or two later, that was back in 2002, 2003, there was a big friction among them. They were discussing how they're going to monetize that stuff. And then there were some conferences. There was already the XP conference going on, and they were discussing to create an agile conference that they would and who would own the brand. And there were already friction in the group of creating the Agile Alliance, where some of them were founded. And then there was a creation of a Scrum Alliance, and that didn't happen because they were friends, right? That happened because they could not agree and who would monetize what. So there was a very strong push, mainly from the Scrum guys, Jeff Sutherland, Ken Schreiber, all that kind of guy, and a few others, to sell trainings and certifications. That came from very early on, and who would own those conferences as well. And there was no, for example, there was even like 1 year, I don't remember, it was 2003 or 4, where the Agile conference was happening. They scheduled the Agile conference and the XP conference on the same day, almost next to each other, right? So that was how bad that became. So that push on pushing like certain methodologies into organizations and creating large scheme training and certifications was by design. So it was not that they said, hey, this is a small methodology just for some highly agile teams and stuff. They were pushing for the mainstream, like a group of it.
Yeah, but I agree that if you have people who are kind of leading that movement already, kind of incentivizing the application of the of the tool where it doesn't fit, right? That's going to have an impact for sure, right? Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say that the monetization is something inherently bad to that, right? And we can go off the tangent of whether certifications are a good thing or not, but I don't think
that it was bad, but it changed the direction originally created in the summit. That's where I was coming from.
Okay, I agree with that, right? So the monetization in itself is not inherently bad, right? Like. Mm-hmm. People need to make a living, right? It's about whether you're doing that at the expense of actually, helping the customer or the client or whatever. And I feel like that's a point. But overall, you have that same thing. The Product Management Institute also has, and they were around even before that, right? So it's not on itself something that is terrible, right? It becomes true when for me, as I said before, you're applying where it doesn't fit, no? Because in the end, all of these methodologies are a tool, right? And just like a spoon, you can use it to eat dessert, or you can use it to poke someone's eye out, right? Like it's not like, it really depends on the intention that you're using it with, right? Even though you may not be aware of that. And this is what not having that foundation sort of creates, where something like, we do daily scrums and, we get together, we synchronize and we increase the feedback loop, becomes controlling people, right? Or becomes...
Just to clarify, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but because I didn't mention all of that to say that what a few individuals did with their methodologies, and I was also not judging them if they were helping or not clients, but what happened right after the summit with certain methodologies that were under the Agile umbrella, they reshaped the direction of Agile. Because some of them became far more popular, in this case, Scrum became massively popular. And that's what I was saying, that it was a blessing and a curse. Because a blessing, because Scrum took Agile worldwide, right? It was Scrum that really made Agile popular. But it also was Scrum that, because of the focus on the process, the other methodologies were left.
Somewhat ironically. Somewhat ironically, because actually the first thing about the manifesto is individuals and interactions over processes and tools.
Exactly.
And the processes kind of started leading rather than the philosophy and the values behind Agile, right?
Yeah. And that's why some of the developers got a bit upset. So again, I'm not criticizing what the founders did with the Scrum and stuff, because they popularized Agile and the mindset. But some developers, as this happened, and because the adoption, that there was people were conflating how many times. It's like, when you are adopting Agile, you were adopting Scrum, and not so there was that direct association at some point that Agile was synonymous of Scrum, And that is, for me, the reason I mentioned that was not to judge that, but to say that there was a separation between developers and Agile because of what happened on the following years. That's where I was coming from.
There is 2 points there, right? One is I agree, it has an impact now, and I think there is a bit more than just the popularization of Scrum. I feel like it really took a different level when Eric Ries, in his Lean Startup book, started putting it into business and into product development. And then it got startups started by default. This is the way that we build product, and started creating this trend. So that aspect is also, I think, pretty important, right? Like when you get a Steve Banks, from 4 Steps to Epiphany, that kind of writing in the Harvard Business Review saying Agile is the shit. No, like this is the way to do things. This is, if you really want to touch your product and apply this stuff, this is the way you have to go. That's when it becomes like really mainstream, and it starts being a conversation at the C-suite rather than a conversation at the technical department or the PM office department, right? So I think that's an aspect there, right? To your other point now is like, sorry, I got lost there. What was your other point? The one that you were saying?
Know. I was just saying stuff, right? I don't know how many times I did.
No. Yeah. So
I said that developers got one of the things that I was saying is that like the developers got a bit detached from how Agile evolved.
So exactly. So my other point was, is it safe to say then that a lot of developers that are part of this outcry, no, Agile is not what it used to be, whatever, right? Have they ever experienced it as it is? Right? Because a lot of people feel like Agile doesn't fit for them, but they, as you were saying, they experience bad Scrum, they experience, all these other things that are not what the essence was, right? So they know they don't like that, but what is the other thing? No? Because a lot of the time, a part of that is, how you also, change that mindset and what you do in there. So I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's actually, it is very difficult you don't adopt the essence immediately. Although there are, I talk about those 4 sentences in the manifesto. They're very easily said and understood at the level of subtlety because they are talking about the essence, right? And, I think in the 5th discipline as well, it talks about, the first kind of stage of adoption is practice, right? The thing is, the Scrum practices are very easy to adopt. They are very simple, the daily stand-up, the sprints, it's not that difficult to adopt, right?
16 pages. 16 pages of the Scrum Manifesto, Scrum, whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. And on the other hand, if you look at XP practices, they take a lifetime because a lot of them are about skills, right? And so but then from the practices, you kind of then start really understanding the principles, and from the principles you get to the essence. But you may have read all about it, but it takes you a long time to internalize. So one can't blame the developers for adopting the Scrum and not the really difficult XP practices immediately, because actually, in order to get to the real essence of Agile, you have to take that journey. And I think Scrum popularized the practices or its practices a lot, whereas XP practices were difficult to adopt, and that's why they were not as popular.
Yeah, and we needed, like, there was what was the name of that book, Jose, that you recommended? I read that Steel, Germs, Guns, and Steel.
Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Guns, Germs, and Steel. So I read that book recently, very recently. And And it also talks about that things evolve according to demand, right? So as different societies organize themselves in a slightly different way, they stop being nomads and hunters to start being farmers. They had to structure themselves better. And those societies evolved a little bit better because they have different needs as they were growing, because they could cultivate food and stuff. So they were staying more local and becoming bigger and bigger. And as they become bigger, they found different problems that they had to optimize, and they evolved faster than other ones that were nomads and stuff. So what was I know that I'm going off on a tangent here, but it was even fascinating to see that the nomads had a child every 4 years, because they could not walk fast enough with adults, while the farmers had more kids like every 2 years or so. So the population grew much bigger. Why am I saying all of that? Is because the market was ripe for better processes. It was not only just to make sure that I'm being fair also to the other people. It's not only that they two people say, hey, we're gonna make these a worldwide success. The market was ripe for better ways of working. So that's why it was not only Scrum. Because if it hadn't been only Scrum, I don't think we would be talking about that. So there was a whole evolution of agile processes in general. A lot of new things were added to backlog management, to acceptance criteria, to ways of collaboration. So when, for example, Kanban became more popular, and you mentioned Lean as well, so that became even stronger because the market was ripe for processes, right? So, but it was not so ripe for the technical disciplines. The process was much easier to show that you could do things differently. But it was difficult for developers to actually show the benefits of the technical practices. It's very, very difficult for you to say, hey, if we do pair programming, mainly pair programming is very controversial in terms of waste and having two people doing the same thing. But if you look at the technical practices, it's much harder to, to describe their value or to quantify their values. And developers are not that great also of talking business, right? So I think that this is another reason that there was the natural Agile evolved in a direction that moved away from software development a bit. And developers felt left out, so they also moved away from Agile. So we even joke is it Agile that moved away from developers, or developers moved away from Agile? And I think it's both.
Well, right? How did developers move away from Agile? I mean, did they just not stay in the same place and Agile moved away?
No, I think, Mash, because for example, if you think about the discussions about Agile software development in the early days, the technical practice were still present. The 10 or 12 other principles that you have in there, they were still valid. But as things evolved, the subject of Agile, in the Agile communities, in Agile conferences, because the evolution was far bigger into the process side, and again, this is not only about Scrum, it's everything else that came around the process side that goes way, way beyond Scrum. So the kind of the topic at the center of the Agile communities became less and less technical and more process and business focused. And some developers that like the hardcore programming stuff became less interested. It's not that they moved away.
I saw both things. I saw both things. So yes, I saw that there was more talk about processes, especially after SAFe came along and that kind of stuff, right? Oh, we need to, again, part of the C-suite conversation, we need to go Agile. Okay, so how do we execute this? No, we need that framework. We need that thing that we can say, oh, we're doing Agile.
SAFe came much later. SAFe came much later.
I know. No, I'm just talking about that evolution where you're saying the focus on process and that kind of stuff. I also saw another tendency to focus more on the human aspect, right? On the coaching and so on, right? And take it at a very high level. No, it's all about people, right? True. And there is a lot associated with the whole coaching aspect, yeah, especially for developers. It's a bit like marketing also has kind of like a bad rep or whatever, at least here in Spain. So I feel like those things also contributed to that separation, that sense of alienation. No, this is gone, in a direction that it doesn't represent us anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you start getting, if you're talking about events, or if you're talking about communities, then you start getting other communities or other things that start popping up, right? Like Socrates or whatever, right? Like there are other points together and talk about software development beyond just the agile conferences or agile communities, right?
Yeah, but
And
that was through the craftsmanship movement, because like the developers that were, let's say, disappointed or felt left behind. For example, I always say we would not be talking about craftsmanship today if Agile
if
as a whole had evolved.
I had solved the problem in the first place.
Exactly. So craftsmanship originally it was a reaction. It was a reaction to the direction that Agile took, and then a lot of people felt left behind, including myself and many others. And then the whole software craftsmanship was almost like an anti movement, or an anti, or how do you call it that in English, like anti-cultural,
Counter.
Yeah, counter movement. Thanks. Yes. So craftsmanship was almost a counter movement, and in the early days of craftsmanship, and that's why craftsmanship in the early days was so focused on extreme programming.
I have a slightly different take. I mean, I by the way, I totally agree that I think craftsmanship movement actually popularized and brought back into the focus the technical practices, in particular XP practices. Mm-hmm. Although one thing I have to say that even before the craftsmanship movement, developers weren't moving away from Agile. They were just not moving in the same kind of process circles, let's say. But if I look back at certain things, there are some aspects that were actually being adopted very well. So things like continuous integration as an XP practice was being adopted very well. In fact, at the beginning there was the likes of cruise control and so on, and then Jenkins became, and even now has become, one of the most prolific tools in software development. Shared code, which is what we call that version control or source control, though that as a practice was taking incremental development was these some of the things that we call Agile, developers weren't moving away from it. They were adopting it quite well. Although other practices like testing and development, pair programming, these kind of things was suffering. And you talk about pair programming being controversial, still is. But TDD was very controversial and still is in some ways, right? But I don't think that it's as simple as developers started moving away from Agile. I think there were some practices they were adopting still, but the focus, especially from management and those, that was more on the processes, and that developers were a bit, let's say, what's the word? Kind of, they were apart from it. They didn't feel part of that conversation, but they were still adopting some Agile practices. What craftsmanship movement did was really bring it into focus and bring all the other practices, especially the XP practices, back into focus.
Yeah, but see, I agree to a certain degree, because, and of course, it's very difficult to generalize, because like developers behave in different ways. Some of them felt really, say, oh, you know what, I was betrayed, and some of them, whatever. Yeah, so these Agile community is doing that. Yeah, I like this Scrum, or I don't like this Scrum. I will work in this way. I don't want. So some people are not. But what I wanted to say was, for example, even the technical things that you mentioned, that continuous integration, for example, was still heavily adopted into Agile, because Agile was still promoting, like even with the Scrum methodology, it was not talking about the how, but they wanted the release software continuously, right? They want that how can I say, predictability and continuously inspect and adapt and release software. So, but for the how, so the evolution of those practices and technologies didn't come from the Agile community. So that happened from outside. So, for example, discussions about different practices, for example, the craftsmanship community not only talked about XP, but it talked about domain-driven design, talked about different types of architecture, talked about different types of testing strategies, talked about different tooling.
And the community of professionals, right? Above all.
Exactly. So it was a community of professionals where multiple technical improvements were discussed, right? So as long as you could optimize what you do things better. But everything that was technical had a home. Yes, XP was at the center as practices, but in the craftsmanship circles, we discussed everything.
Many other things. Any new kind of trends and ways of working that were considered good in terms of agility, good in terms of providing value.
And this is what I said. So it's not that they most of the developers like moved away from Agile, but they were not going into the Agile circles to discuss technology or technical practices. They were doing that outside. This is what I meant by.
Yeah. Other than the XP circles.
But the XP circles remained XP, right? So they would potentially talk about Agile, but they themselves were not. I don't know. The XP group was always a bit strange to me, like in a way. So I say that some people might be watching. They will probably shout at me on Twitter, but like they didn't like the craftsmanship movement much at the beginning. Right.
Yeah,
so
that I agree with.
So at the beginning, this is why at the beginning
it's worth actually talking about, because I think they said, well, why not call it XP? But I think craftsmanship was much more than XP, or had a different focus. Let's say I think the values of XP and craftsmanship aligned very well.
Totally.
And so we were promoting XP practices. But I think from the XP community, there was this thing about, well, if it's about XP, then why don't you just call it XP? And our view was that actually it's about other things as well, right? And the focus is different.
I think that if it was just that, I think we would have get along well. But I felt that they didn't like that craftsmanship was born because it was like they talked about those things and no one else should talk about those things. And they also discredited those things. The problem is that they were doing fuck all about XP. That is the truth. They were like in isolated groups around the world, very small groups, and they didn't do much for XP to follow Scrum and to become mainstream. And then when a new group, full of energy, because they lost their energy, because the XP predates Agile, right? So the XP groups predates Agile. So they were bundled into another group, right? So, and then that group left them behind. And then a new group comes in to talk about the things that they were discussing a few years ago. So they were not welcoming that.
I think part of this is that actually, there is an element of the XP, as we said, XP practices are very difficult to adopt. A lot of them are about lifetime skills. There's a lot about the essence and the values, right? XP is actually, in a way, designed to evolve. And so XP itself as a body of knowledge, I think, is absolutely amazing. I can't say a lot, to be honest. I don't really know a lot about the XP community, other than the fact that, yes, there was definitely a resistance in the XP community to software craftsmanship. But I think it was difficult as well for them. But I can't say much about whether they could have done more to have XP, to have it popularized more. Not sure what they could have done.
Yeah, to be fair, like I don't want you to blame anyone, because like I never wanted anyone to come to me and say what I should do with my own time and money, like mainly with spare time. So all those people have great intentions. They were sharing their knowledge on their spare time, So I don't want to say that they should have done this or that, because they should do whatever they want with their time and stuff. I can only say that in general, as a community, they didn't push that much. So XP was created in one way. They evolved that a little bit in the early days, in the early 2000s, but it never went beyond than that. We didn't see an evolution of XP. We didn't see XP evolving as either a methodology or even as an ideology.
So do you think that if XP had created its own, certification schema and being able to monetize that and make it profitable, would that have been better for the movement?
No. I think XP, the thing that would have really worked is the thing that worked for Craftsmanship, which is focus on community, which is building those bridges, becoming bigger, adopting it in the community of like the craftsmanship communities, the likes of craftsmanship conferences, and all those things that we had, where people were so eager to come and share knowledge. And yes, XP had their communities as well, but not at the level, right? And also the craftsmanship community, I think, in a way, was much more, had a lower barrier to entry. There was a lot of focus on practice. There was a lot of focus on beginners. So it wasn't about a bunch of experts discussing big ideas. It was much more humble, in my view. You would go there, you talk about whatever anyone wants to talk about, but also you'd practice katas, you'd practice little other coding techniques, you'd practice different languages that have come through, technologies, frameworks. Anything went. One of the things when we ran the London Software Craftsmanship community, what the biggest thing was, don't make it exclusive to a particular group, right? So we would, if we had a coding exercise, we would be at pains to create the templates for all the different type of languages so that we could welcome everybody in there.
Yeah, that's the same here.
Yeah, so this is what I think that the difference between. I agree with you, Mash. I think that the craftsmanship community did a very good job to embrace a lot of younger or more inexperienced developers and introduce them to a wider community, to practices, to knowledge in general. And we were also not just focused in one discipline. Although the XP community is quite open-minded, they don't meet just to discuss XP. They meet to discuss loads of stuff.
But
right?
when we were talking about Agile, one of the things that you brought up as a way, let's say, something that influenced the popularization of, in particular, Scrum, for instance, right, was the whole certification program. Someone behind it, sort of feeding the machine, and that is not based out of community. The community, I think, came later as a result of people having problems and trying to get together and solve those things, because it was something that was still very early when it comes to the adoption and the solution for a lot of these things, right? So it's interesting now that you're saying what would have helped is the community aspect and not having the same, let's say, machinery or structure that the other thing had. Right?
No, because for example, as I said, the certification, I don't think that was the main drive. I think it was just a business opportunity because there was demand, and the certification was a way to monetize on that demand. But the demand was there. I'm happy that neither the XP community nor the craftsmanship community went down that route, and we just talked about the community and we tapped on the demand with knowledge, with sharing, and creating a community. Because the XP community, they did that as well, not potentially to the extent that other communities did, but they did. You could go to their meetings whenever you wanted, and you would always be welcoming there. But we made conscious effort to bring people in, right? So I think that's probably the biggest difference. But I think that the certification was just on top. I don't think that the certification was what. The certification created a different type of population, because then people said, oh, you know what? Because there is a lot of need in the market, if I want to tap into that industry, I can certify myself, so I will have a better chance to get a job.
It's not only that, because the whole schema is, you get trainers, and then those trainers are part of their goal is to proliferate the idea, right? Because that's where work comes from, right? So to some extent, I feel like that would have also helped, independently of whether you think, having an XP certification would mean that you know what you're doing or not, right? Which is the same case with, but just having that machinery behind it, as in people with the intention of making it popular, making it, adopted and so on, I think it would have helped. I think it would definitely have made it spread a lot faster, and maybe we'll get the same problems that you're finding somewhere else, right, when it comes to the quality and so on. But the idea
I don't think
still
that there
there.
was demand, because for example, one thing about certification, the certification allows professionals in that area to distinguish themselves among the other professions. So that's what the certification, in theory, I'm not defending that, but this is what I think. But even before the certifications, you need to have a demand from the market so that they would choose the perceived more knowledgeable professionals, assuming that in their mind that certification would provide that distinction. But the demand was not there either. So this is the problem. It's not create a certification from XP without having a marketing demand. I'm not sure if it would have had the same impact. See what I'm saying?
Do you think there's a demand now?
We will never know.
Well, this question leads us to the original question of this episode then. So is it possible to bring developers back together, Agile and developers back together?
And what does it take? No. What would it take?
Yeah, I think that is not possible.
I personally think that Agile and developers are together. Other things have come in there. Test-driven development, although, yes, we live in some sort of a bubble in terms of, adoption of Agile practices, in particular XP practices, is very, TDD is now widely regarded as a good practice. Now, this is a win, right? Pair programming is regarded a good practice, whether what people say about it afterwards or in their own private time, but they do regard it. Now there's many other new things coming through, but the main thing that has I think has brought people back and brought a lot of things together, including Agile, Lean, all these things, is the DevOps movement. Right. And this is bringing, with that, there is platform engineering. With that, there is infrastructure code. There is the continuous delivery aspect as well. Right. These things are very well regarded. And any modern or not so modern company who are building software, they do think of these as good practices. Right. And they are in most, at least the people that we meet, our clients and through the community and other communities as well, they want to adopt these practices, and they set out to do so as well, right? So these things are even being taught at university. So I don't think that there is that kind of thing where Agile and developers are kind of apart. I personally think, regardless of what happened with Scrum and these kind of Agile at scale and all that stuff, regardless of what happened there, Agile is very much alive within the developer community.
So the reason that I think that for people like us that went through the before Agile, creation of Agile, evolution of Agile, and where we are now, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding, knowing you well and stuff, you are connecting those new practices or movements, even like the DevOps, to the original Agile mindset from the early days, right? So if you are making that kind of connection, I would agree with your statement. However, I don't think that, for example, developers that joined our industry 10 years ago, like we are already into 2021. Sometimes we don't realize how old we are, right? So 10 years ago, Agile was already 10 years old. Craftsmanship was already a thing, and Agile was unrecognizable compared to 2001. So a lot of developers that join our industry today, they would never associate DevOps or even extreme or TDD to Agile. For them, it's a completely different thing. Agile is a group of people that talk about process, including Scrum. So there's no resemblance. Like the mindset was 20 years ago. New developers don't even associate. They cannot join those. There is a big resistance from new developers to Agile today.
Well, in that case, I'm very much out of touch with the mindset of new developers.
You don't see developers today saying, I want to go to an Agile conference. You just don't see that.
I am talking about the mindset. I'm talking about the manifesto. I'm talking about agility, and I would say that's why I'm saying that it's not doom and gloom. In fact, our industry is actually moving very well and at a good pace towards that aspect, right? So the development practices of 20 years ago and what we see as the norm now, there is a world of difference, and it's a good difference.
And I would say more. I think that a lot of that is driven by new companies and new business that doesn't necessarily need to go through that transformation phase of their culture and that kind of stuff. Like they're already born, digital. They can from the beginning, use the cloud, do DevOps, that kind of stuff, right? And there are more and more of those, and the results that they're getting are better, right? This is why bigger companies are trying to go through that transition. Otherwise, it wouldn't be necessary if they thought it was not something that would allow them a competitive edge, right? And that's going to continue. You can only see it accelerate, right? Like you look for any unicorn nowadays, that's actually all of them are doing this stuff. It's part of their culture. The technical aspect is at the forefront of when they're hiring, their processes and that kind of stuff, right? And I think that's only going to continue accelerating, right? Either on the for the laggers, it will be about the transformation, and for the newcomers, it's about that. And I feel like having the opportunity to work at a company that already has that mindset, is a big, stepping stone or point of comparison for everything else, right? Like if you go everywhere you go, you'll be able to see, this is not. It smells, right? Like it's not. I don't know. I'm not a certified XYZ, but if we're talking about this is not a good place because it's not focusing on the essence, right? Delivering the value, the collaboration, and so on, right? So, so that's what I feel like. I also share a less gloomy kind of view on that. I do agree, like you said some time ago, there is a reputation problem. Like there is this perception of Agile that is detriment of trying to go back to the roots or win over developers again, or getting this kind of traction back into the movement. But there's life beyond Agile, right? Like you know what I mean? I also, when people are we should do things, it's like there are many ways of doing software, right? And there are many, it doesn't need a name. You don't need to be doing one specific thing in order to be doing things right and delivering the right things and creating value and all those things. And this is the essence, right? So from that point of view, I think it will get better for sure. And things, at some point we'll go back to maybe what it was, no, in that sense.
I don't have a gloomy view. What I just want to be very clear here. So what I said is that I have zero hope that developers will be going back to the Agile communities. I don't think that's going to happen. But that doesn't mean that this is a bad thing, because Agile today is a different thing from tomorrow. So I'm going to explain, right? So what I was trying to say is, given what happened over the years, Agile has its own niche now, which is a different one from what was 20 years ago. Agile is focused on better processes and went way beyond Scrum, right? So it's about people collaboration, it's about feedback at different levels as well, right? So not only at the team level, but scaling and other things.
About business agility. Agile is now about business agility. It went beyond. This is the point that I was trying to make before. Like, it quickly outgrew the original context, and now it's, I think, a lot more powerful or impactful in other areas of the organization that are not just technically related.
But see, this is why I was saying, precisely why I was saying that I don't have a gloomy view. I just don't think that developers will be going back to the Agile community, but I don't think it's a bad thing. For example, when you mentioned that a natural evolution went from adopting Scrum to more focus on business agility in a much broader sense, developers would not do that themselves. They would not have created that big contribution themselves, because that's not where their focus was. So for me, Agile, keeping as it is, has a place to keep evolving business agility as our business become more complex and different, right? So I'm happy where Agile is today, given everything we know. And Lean did the same thing, right? So, but then what happened? Developers start moving to other areas. And they use their knowledge, their passion, their skills to evolve other areas that need it on the technical aspect, right? So, for example, so then we evolved far more technical practices. We create a lot of new architectural styles, right? So in the cloud and stuff, we created far more new tools for automation, from testing, from deployment. And those evolutions would not come from certain people in the Agile community either. So for me, like, that division today is not bad, actually. It's actually good. The good thing that I see that positive is that, as Mash was saying, for example, companies matured. Because, like, if you look at 20 years back, so there is a new norm now. The expectation is to deliver faster, to have that feedback loop at different areas, to improve the process, and also some technical improvements. And we are seeing that with a lot of modern software modernization initiatives and people investing on the technical side, on cloud technologies, on continuous delivery and stuff. So the industry matured. And with that, different professionals are making different impacts with the DevOps movement, with the Lean movement, with Agile movement, as it is, a bit away from the hardcore tech, and people in the craftsmanship community and other tech communities, in DDD, in other tech communities, evolving their stuff. But the good thing that we have today, what we didn't have 10 to 15 years ago, where we were all trying to fight our space because we were all put in the same bucket. And I don't think we were fitting in the same bucket. What happened was Lean. Remember, like, how many conferences we had in Agile where Kanban and Scrum, how many talks we had? Kanban is shit, Scrum is shit. And the Kanban and Scrum people banging their heads against each other, and the XP people, and the craftsmanship against Agile. So, see what I'm saying? So it's settled down now. We all find our own space, and we are coexisting nicely, and we are in a better place. So my view is actually very positive. But going back to the original question, do I see developers going back to Agile communities and evolving that side of our industry? No, I don't.
So I think, by the way, totally agree that professionals with different disciplines are evolving their disciplines, and it's all one community. But there is an element of, and asking that question to developers going back to Agile, they need to, right? If they are not being, and which I don't think so, I think they are. There needs to be crossover, because it is a systems view, right? Practices, processes, values, principles, all these things, they sit together to create one good, healthy team. And everyone needs to understand the other aspects as well. So if you're a developer, you do need to understand processes. You need to have a good understanding behind the processes, the values, the essence, and all those things that we were talking about. So if people are not if as a developer you see yourself as purely I'm gonna be looking at my technical things and so on, then you're actually doing yourself a big disservice, because you're missing a very large part of what makes you a good developer, which is all the people aspect, all the process aspect, and so on. And similarly with the other side as well, right? All the other things. There needs to be a good level of collaboration between the communities, and of course the specialists within disciplines are evolving those and leading the evolution. But that doesn't mean that others should not be taking part in that.
It's just like the diagrams. I think that I thought that's why I said I think that we are in a better place. We coexist, and coexist means we adopt each other's practice. We cooperate, exactly. So what I see is that as new collaborative ways are evolving or created in other communities, I think the developers are open to embrace and work in different ways. They have the agility mindset and say, hey, let's try this approach or that approach. They might not be at the center of the evolution of those methodologies or business agility. That's not but I think that the developers today are very open, and they own their teams. Like, they are running their teams, they're running their process, they embrace the proximity with their stakeholders and stuff like that. But they are not probably the ones that like spending their energy outside working hours. Like, how can we create a better process, or how can we evolve business agility? But they are open when those things evolve. Some of them contribute. There is an intersection, but that intersection is smaller today. But it goes both ways. For example, as you said, Mesh, a few times during this talk, some of the technical disciplines, even the evolution of the DevOps movement, for example, all of those things are much easily combined today than they were in the past, right? So in the past, there were more friction, let's say, among those groups. Today is more like, what can we do to make it us better?
Yeah, and you think all these things because actually the DevOps movement itself, borrows heavily from Lean, right? Yeah. And as the technical practice, and from platform engineering and infrastructure as code and continuous, all these things, they kind of come full circle in a way. But yes, I totally agree that I think there is a much more cooperation between all these different ways of working to be able to then tailor for each context. Every context is different, and you look at all these things and all the ways of working and everything else and see what works within that context.
Cool. Okay, Jose, any final words?
No, I really enjoyed this conversations. We need to work on having another one on the past, present, future of craftsmanship and so on. I think that would be also quite interesting. But yeah, that's I think we're more or less on time, so maybe wrapping up.
Yeah, Mash, any final words?
No, nothing from me. I've already said my piece. Thank you.
Cool. Well, as always, if you enjoyed this chat, leave us a comment. Tell us what you want us to discuss. Put a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel, and we hope to see you soon. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.